before we start, I'd like to give a round of applause to the Granddaughter. Really put us into the spirit of the 1940s, so that was lovely. I'm Liz Fuller. I'm the president of the Southport Historical Society. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you, if you have notes already, to join me in turning the sound off on your phone. Actually, don't know how, so I shouldn't. All right, I want to welcome all of you and thank you for coming to help us commemorate the sinking of the SS John D. Gill, which happened 80 years ago tonight at about 10 o'clock in the evening, when a Nazi U-boat torpedoed a merchant ship right off of Southport shore. The purpose of today's event is to remember the crew of the SS John D. Gill, the Navy Armed Guard, and the Merchant Marines, those who survived and those who sacrificed their lives, and the members of the Oak Island Coast Guard, who risked their own lives to rescue the survivors and to recover the casualties. The program is also to remember the men and women of Southport, maybe even your own parents or grandparents, who were suddenly confronted with the realities of World War II in their hometown. Those men and women rose to the occasion and in so doing became hometown heroes. The Southport Historical Society has worked hard to put together a program which will honor those heroes, but we couldn't have done it without our sponsors, especially the City of Southport, who provided this building for us, which we're especially thankful for on this cold day, and the Brunswick Arts Council and North Carolina Arts Council, who are so supportive of our efforts to put together a program that combines history and music and art, and all of the other sponsors listed in your program. If you feel moved to help us continue to put on programs like this, please make use of the donation jar and the credit card tip jar by the door. And now, to lead us through our program this afternoon is Mckeithen-Watts Poole. Mary Ellen is a valued member of the Southport Historical Society Board. Her grandparents and father were some of those hometown heroes that I was talking about. You might have seen their photos in the exhibits. Mary Ellen's grandfather was a Southport fishing boat captain who helped the war effort by working as a confidential informant for the United States Navy. While out on his boat, he kept an eye out for enemy ships and other suspicious activity offshore. His certificate is on display. Mary Ellen's grandfather was about 40 when the war started, and her father was 17. Both father and son enlisted and served in the military, her grandfather in the Navy and her father in the Coast Guard. But those weren't the only heroes in the family. Mary Ellen's grandmother also became a hero 80 years ago because she was one of the volunteer Red Cross nurses who helped care for the injured survivors of the SS John D. Gill. We'll be hearing more about the importance of those volunteer nurses in a few minutes when Tish Hayden tells us about her own grandmother's experiences caring for the survivors of the John D. Gill. So now, I'd like to turn the program over to the granddaughter of Captain Hulen and Annie Mae Mckeithen-Watts, Ms. Mary Ellen-Watts Poole.
I want to make sure everybody can hear me, and I want to say this. I asked Liz to take my southern accent out of the microphone, but you will notice after you hear me for a little while that it didn't work. I want to do some historical society business before we start with our program. I want to recognize somebody that has been a great asset to the Southport Historical Society. And today is a big day for him. I want to acknowledge and say happy birthday to Bob Surridge. He's in the back. Bob Surridge is our past president, and I want to say during his tenure, we were under COVID and other restrictions. And it's unbelievable that during his tenure, we received awards and we exceeded so many goals that we established for ourselves. So thank you, Bob, for that. Okay.
Mary Ellen, you have to hold the microphone to your mouth, darling.
Okay. I will. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Pat. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to today's program. I'm Mary Ellen Watts Poole, and as Liz mentioned, this program today is very personal for me, as it is for many of you. I'm proud of what my dad and grandparents, along with many Southport residents, did. And I'm glad that their contributions are being remembered and recognized today. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But right now, I'd like us all to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which will be led by members of Scout Troop 1776.
How close can you go in? Oh, go ahead.
Color Guard, attention. Please join me in presenting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. 2. Color Guard, post the flags of the United States of America. Color Guard, honor the flags. Color Guard, retreat.
Thank you, Scouts. It is especially fitting that the Scouts are here with us today and helping with this program. 80 years ago, the Boy Scouts were very involved in helping with the civil defense of Southport. The Scout troop was led by the local American Legion Post number 194. Back in those days, not everybody had telephones. And of course, there was no television, no internet, and no Facebook. It wasn't always easy to let people know important information in a quick manner. So when the town decided they needed to have a meeting to discuss safety and civil defense to prepare for an emergency like that one that happened with the John D. Gill, they called upon the Boy Scouts. The Scouts ran through the streets, going door to door, and told everyone about the meeting, where to go and when to come. And as many of you know, after the sinking of the John D. Gill, one man named Mckeithen-Watts, who his friends called Benny, could not be returned to his family in the Philippines because his country was under Japanese occupation. The citizens of Southport came together and buried him in Northwood Cemetery. The American Legion paid for the funeral and acted as his pallbearers. And the Boy Scouts came out in uniform and provided a last salute. And now I'd like to ask Tommy Harrelson to please come forward and lead us in a prayer. Tommy. Yes, sir.
Thank you all for doing this. It's just fantastic all for coming. Good evening. We have been through some challenging times facing the pandemic. And that same time, our first responders and caregivers still had to do their duty to their fellow men and women in times of crisis, much like the rescuers and caregivers did after the tragic sinking of the John D. Gill so many years ago. We remember the words of Isaiah, "For I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not, I am the one who helps you." Let us bow our heads in prayer. Almighty God, you lend your strength to all those who are there for us in times of crisis, fear, and hurt. You give courage to the first responders, including the Coast Guard and caregivers, who continue to do this important work they are called to do, looking beyond the risk for those who need your help and protection. We give you thanks for the many ways they give of themselves, their skills and knowledge in these troubling times. Protect them, O Lord. Extend your shielding hand over them and comfort their hearts when they are weary and heartbroken. God, we also lift up in prayer of thanksgiving and comfort for the families of first responders and caregivers and all who support them. Give them hope and courage. Surround them with your loving presence and bring them peace when their loved ones rush toward uncertainty and danger. All this we pray in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Tommy. We're pleased to have Tommy offer the prayer today. Not only is he an eloquent speaker, but he is also the grandson of one of those hometown heroes. His grandfather, J.J. Laughlin, was the administrator for Dozier Hospital. It was a new position for him. He had only been on the job for 3 weeks when the attack occurred. Suddenly, he was confronted with an emergency bigger than any that had ever been seen at Dozier Hospital before. There were only 2 doctors and 5 nurses in the entire hospital. In the early morning hours of March 13th, the Coast Guard brought 11 injured men and 16 casualties to Southport, landing at a dock that was close to where the Quiddler's Bench is now. Southport didn't have any ambulances, so Mr. Laughlin asked anyone with one of those old woody station wagons to come to the waterfront and help carry the injured to the hospital. Afterwards, they did the same with the casualties, carrying the bodies to the Harrow's Funeral Home on Moore Street, where Mr. Kilpatrick and Mrs. Elizabeth Gilbert were also overwhelmed with 16 bodies to care for all at one time. Of course, Mr. Laughlin didn't do all of this all by himself. He asked others, perhaps your grandfathers, to help. One of the ones he recruited was his own 14-year-old son, Joe Sam Laughlin, who helped carry the dead. 2 years later, at the age of 16, that same young man would enlist in the Navy to help fight the war. As you can see, this was a big event that affected nearly everyone in Southport one way or another. And so it is my honor to ask our mayor, Dr. Joe Pat Hayden, to say a few words about the significance of this event to Southport. Mayor.
First of all, thank you all for being here. This is a wonderful turnout. And what I've said as mayor, one of the top priorities is historic preservation, the preservation of the history of Southport. I try to proclaim it at every meeting, and yes, your history is so important to the vitality and the vibrancy of our city. We take that history and we bring it forward, just like Mary Ellen said, no Facebook, no internet back then. But we can bring that spirit that her parents, her grandparents had, the Hickman family, the Harrison family, C2 from back there, McNeil family. So this is what is, and for those of us who came here, I'm so grateful that there are people that have come here and have embraced it and proclaimed it. So 80 years ago, we commemorate what happened. War is hard, and the horror that those men went through. But think of how this city rose up and said, no, we will rise above the horror and the war and the killing of innocent people. We will defend it. We will overcome it. And they did that in that spirit 80 years ago. And I'm so proud of all of us, not only the nurses, the people who volunteered, who came down to the waterfront to pick up not only the injured, but those who died. It is a remarkable story, and Southport is so humble about it. But I'm so grateful that the Southport Historical Society is doing this today. I'm grateful they asked Tish to speak for her grandmother and for those nurses that volunteered on that day. It is a remarkable story, and as mayor, we will always proclaim the history of Southport, and in particular today, as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the sinking of the John D. Gill. So thank you for being here. I've already learned a lot from listening to Mary Ellen talk about the Scouts and how they participated, and proud of Tommy's grandfather, J.J. Lockwood. I mean, these unsung heroes. I mean, how many of you knew that the superintendent, they called him the superintendent at that time, the administrator, was J.J. Lockwood in 1942. I'm sure a lot of us may not have. So we proclaim those that served on that day. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to enjoyed this program so much already. I look forward to the rest of it, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. You know, 4 of the men who died that day were U.S. Navy Armed Guard. They were accompanying the ship to help try and protect it from the attack. The rest of the men, 19 in all, were merchant marines. Many people don't know exactly who the merchant marines were and what they did. They weren't military. They were civilians, just like you and me, just trying to do their job. And their jobs were essential to the war effort. They carried oil, supplies, weapons, and troops. Without them, the jobs they did, there was no way for the United States or our allies to win the war. That's why they were such a higher target with a higher casualty rate than any of the branches of the military. And now, to sing the praises of the Merchant Marines, I would like to ask the South Brunswick Bellas to sing the Merchant Marine song, Heave Ho, My Lads, Heave Ho.
It's a long, long roll with our ashes full, bringing the wind
Thank you, Bellas. That was great. I do want to say that that song was performed by the Bellas for you today especially. This song was not part of what they normally do, and they learned this song just to present it today. Even on today's solemn occasion, it's important to take a moment for joy by listening to songs like that. Southport co-founder Susie Carson was only a few years older than these ladies when World War II broke out. It was a scary and uncertain time for all the young people of Southport. But Susie wrote that there were moments of joy as well. She recalled sitting on the garrison lawn with her friends, and that's just right outside of this building site. With no other form of entertainment, she and her friends would sit on the lawn at sunset, watch the boats pass by on the river, and sing songs to entertain themselves, sounding, I'm sure, pretty much like these young ladies did today. Perhaps your mother, grandmothers, or aunts were with her. I've mentioned several times today the number of people who stepped up to help after the sinking of the John D. Gill. Unfortunately, 80 years later, none of them are still with us. But I'd like to recognize people who are here today. So if there are any World War II veterans or their spouses here today, please stand if you will, or raise your hands. We want to thank them for their service. If there are any members of the Coast Guard here, and I know they are, please stand. They are. Thank you for your service. If there are any members of the American Legion here today, please stand. Thank you so much for your service. And now I'd like to address the descendants. If you are descended from Mr. Laughlin or from any of the volunteer Red Cross nurses or Dozier Hospital nurses or Mr. Kilpatrick or members of the Southport American Legion or the Civilian Defense or the Red Cross, please stand. Yes, sir. You remember Merchant Marines? Okay. Please stand up, sir.
The military sea transport. It's just starting to feel packed. We took 4,000 American soldiers, fully armed, on the general patch to Bremerhaven, field ready. They got off the gangway, onto the train, and out into the field. And if you don't think we were a prime target, you got another thought coming.
Thank you, sir. Now, you may not know of any family stories, and you may be wondering whether your family did anything to contribute to this event. Well, Mr. Laughlin and Mrs. Margaret Harper of the Red Cross collected magazines, cigarettes, clothes, books, and other essentials for the survivors. So it's likely that your family donated items and attended the funeral for Mr. Tingzong. So if you're descended from anyone who lived in Southport during World War II, please stand. If you're a veteran who has not yet been recognized, or you are active duty military, please stand. And we thank you for your service. At the Historical Society, we often focus on the past, but history is only important because remembering and understanding the past helps us to build a better future. So now I'd like to take a moment to recognize the future leaders of Southport, the Scouts and the Bellas, who are here today that are helping us during this commemoration. Thank all of you, and good luck to you in the future. And now, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, my friend, Mrs. Tish Hagan. Tish is the granddaughter of Mrs. Josephine Hickman, one of the Red Cross volunteer nurses who stepped in to care for the injured men. Tish?
My grandmother and Mary Ellen's grandmother were dear, dear friends. Thank you all for being here. There are so many heroes in the room, which we've seen when you've all stood at different moments during this program. And I thank you for being here. And I'd just like to acknowledge that my father is here. He was 9 years old at the time they were. I'm honored to represent my grandmother, Josephine Johnson Hickman, and the women of Southport who answered the call of duty as Red Cross nurses' aides when World War II came to the shore in the small fishing village of Southport, North Carolina. When the old tanker, John D. Gill, on its way from Texas to Philadelphia, was torpedoed Thursday, March 12, 1942, 25 miles off the coast of Southport. I want to thank Liz Fuller, President of the Southport Historical Society, for asking me to speak on this occasion. Thank you, Liz. From the Wilmington Morning Star, Monday, March 16, 1942. The front page headline, 11 oil-stained and flame-seared survivors of tanker sunk off coast tell gripping story of fight for life. The subheading, war-wrecked crew members under treatment at hospital in Southport. Quoting from that article in the Morning Star, at 1 o'clock Friday afternoon, a small group of oil-stained and flame-seared men were brought ashore in a Coast Guard patrol boat landed at Southport. There were 11 of 26 survivors of a giant U.S. oil tanker which went down off the southeastern North Carolina coast 24 hours after a torpedo from an enemy submarine ripped into its side and scattered an inferno of blazing oil for miles around the turbulent sea. The photo on the front page, 5 oil-covered and burned men from the John D. Gill. The caption, men who cheated death arrive at Southport, covered in film of black oil and suffering from burns and shock. The survivors of the tanker, which was torpedoed Thursday night, are shown at Dozier Memorial Hospital at Southport. They were rescued from the ocean by a Coast Guard patrol boat, which landed them at the fishing town. The second photo, 2 men, bandaged hands, arms, facial burns, side by side on a hospital bed, gently grasping bandaged hands in a handshake of solidarity and resolve. The caption, heroes of torpedo tankers, survivors, Herbert L. Gardner Jr. left a wiper in the engine room of the giant tanker, which was struck by an Axis torpedo late Thursday night, shakes hands with Quartermaster Edward Cheney. The front page newspaper from March 16, 1942, Morning Star, was displayed in my grandparents' home in a sitting area where they enjoyed their morning coffee. Although, as a young girl, I didn't understand the significance of the faded yellow newsprint and the heroes and the horror it contained. My grandmother, Josephine Hickman, was very proud of her training as a Red Cross nurse's aide and her participation in the events surrounding the sinking of the John D. Gill. It was a special moment in her life and the lives of so many Southport people. Volunteerism was important to my grandmother and my grandfather, for the hospital and for the city. Their home was located across the street from Dozier Hospital, where the current city hall now stands. With that location, they were aware of the activity as people entered and exited Southport. They could identify every local vehicle as it traveled by. This was entertaining to me, certainly an example of days gone by. I was even told that there was no police station at the time. Their home phone number was the number to reach the police, and their own automobile was the police car. During the war and beyond, they lived the life of dedication and volunteerism for the city of Southport. The night of March 12th, around 10 p.m., a loud explosion. Then a few minutes later, a blazing bonfire on the water that could be easily seen from Southport waterfront. According to my father, Elliot Hickman, who was at that time 9 years old and was standing next to Mac's Cafe watching the blaze. To quote my father, there were a lot of people, a crowd gathered. We were aware of what had happened. German submarines were known to be off the coast of North Carolina and other southern states. What they did not know was that the fire was started when a crewman tossed over a life ring fitted with a self-igniting carbide light, and the oil surrounding the ship exploded into flames. They were also unaware at the time of the inferno, of the carnage, the struggle for survival, and the heroic efforts of that night and early morning, or that they would be receiving 11 injured survivors or 16 bodies, including Catalina Tizon from the Philippines. All 16 of the deceased were returned home except one, Mr. Tizon. Due to the war, he could not be returned home, and the citizens of Southport buried him in Northwood Cemetery. My grandfather, Otto Hickman, was Southport's police chief and the only police officer in Southport. One of the ways in which Southport citizens knew that German submarines were off the coast was an unusual phenomenon that occurred in a local beauty parlor. When the metal dome hair dryer was placed over a customer's head, they would hear rhythmic sounds coming through. The owner of the parlor contacted my grandfather and several other Southport officials and concluded it must be Morse code that was being transmitted from German submarines. Another way in Southport, which Southport knew there was war, that there was a nightly protocol for a blackout in Southport. My grandmother was an air raid warden. She would make sure that the lights were out in her assigned area, that the blinds were down, the cars with headlights, the top half painted black, and that when the siren at the fire station alarmed during a drill, the lights were supposed to be off. My grandfather was also a member of the Southport Fire Department, and at one time the fire chief. Josephine Hickman was 29 years old when John D. Gill sank off the coast of Southport. She and the women of Southport, Red Cross trained nurses aides, had completed the course and received their Red Cross pin, which I am wearing today, and received their certificate the same week as the tanker was torpedoed. The course was taught by Mary Ferguson, a registered nurse and wife of Dr. Elsie Ferguson. However, what they encountered was not fully covered in any Red Cross course. Quotes from my grandmother, who in an article was described as a Red Cross nurse at Dozier Memorial Hospital. when the survivors were brought in. They were so pitiful. We barely got in our training, but we did the best we could. We didn't think half of them could live. They were so burned, almost to a crisp, and covered with oil. Some of them were burned so badly that the bandages were all over their hands. Only their mouths were open. We just fed them in between the bandages. There were only 5 trained nurses in the hospital. The rest, like my grandmother, were Red Cross volunteers. They worked 20 hours straight. My grandmother was in the OR assisting when the lights went out. She figured out that the plug in the OR light had fallen out and would not stay in. She was a petite woman, 5 feet 3 inches tall. My grandmother had to stand on a chair to reinsert the plug to the operating room light and held it in place for several hours. There was a concern that she might receive a shock by putting the plug back in. Without hesitation, she reinserted the cord and held it in place so the procedure could be completed. Again, quoting my grandmother, "We barely got in our training when this tanker was torpedoed offshore here, and we were faced with this terrible tragedy. But we managed to save every one of them." My grandmother framed her Red Cross certificate as well as the newspaper article. They were on display. They are here on display in the community building today. They will be returned to the mayor's office in City Hall, where my grandparents' home was located. I would like to read her certificate, the American National Red Cross Volunteer Service Certificate. This certifies that Josephine Johnson Hickman has completed the prescribed course for nurses' aid conducted by the Brunswick County chapter of the American National Red Cross, issued at Washington, D.C., March 1942. There are 2 signatures that are readily recognizable. Top left, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President. Bottom right, Annie Mae Woodside, Chapter Chairman, Southport native and Superintendent of Brunswick County Schools. My grandmother was so proud of this certificate and the Red Cross arm patch and Red Cross pin she wore on her white uniform, the same as all other volunteer nurses. In 1994, 3 of the survivors of the John D. Gill returned to Southport for the 52nd anniversary and dedication of the monument at Waterfront Park. My grandmother was so proud to see these men and be a part of the ceremony. They were all so young in 1942. Their remembrances were heartfelt and reunion of tragedy and triumph. One of the survivors present was Herbert Gardner, who was in the photograph in the Wilmington Morning Star with bandages on both arms, and was beside Edwin Cheney, who was credited with saving 6 of the men that night and was awarded the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal by President Franklin D. Roosevelt for his actions the night that John D. Gill sank. The Red Cross nurse volunteers, including my grandmother, Josephine Hickman, did not need an award. They were proud volunteers who met the challenges of caring for badly injured men of the John D. Gill, and their life-saving actions gave them satisfaction of volunteerism and of love, compassion, and hope, along with their Red Cross pins and certificates they carried with them, and the men of the John D. Gill and World War II in their hearts for the rest of their lives, and made an example for generations to follow.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We should mention a hero of the catastrophe was a quartermaster. For those that may not know, the quartermaster is the person that steers the ship. One of them, because there are on 3 watches and there's 3 of them. Talking time and again, she brought up about fuel oil. The fuel oil on board the ship, especially with stuff all the stuff advisedly that they used to propel the ship, burn, make steam, turn the propeller, etc., was by tar. And if you ever touch tar, you know it's almost impossible to get it off you. And then it's burning the side, so give you a little larger aspect to the heroism of these merchant seamen.
Thank you, Tish. That was such a moving presentation that you gave us today. One of the unique joys of a local historical society is that we can focus on the history of our own town and the contributions of the families and people who lived here. At the Southport Historical Society, we believe that this focus makes us all feel more connected to history and to Southport. We hope that you all feel a sense of appreciation and connection today. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and all of the people who worked to make today possible. But we are not quite done yet. We would like to invite all of you to join us down by the waterfront. The Coast Guard, the American Legion, the Bellas, and the Smithfield Guard, which is the Thor Cannon crew, are all going to help us pay tribute to the crew of the John D. Gill. We will also have flowers available for you to go out on the pier and say your own prayers and thanks to the men and women who have lost their lives fighting for our country. So please make your way to the waterfront. That will start at 5 p.m. at the monument.